How is the UFC ripping off its fighters? Let's go through the contracts and find the absolutely weird clauses that are hidden in them. Now, to understand the issues at hand better, we have to look at the financials of the UFC behind the scenes. Fact is, UFC is a thriving business. They have boasted record-breaking numbers year after year, and the Endeavor takeover only seems to have put some more wind in their sails. They have had record-breaking revenues this year, last year, and they're just in a race with themselves, it seems. One good thing about the takeover of Endeavor is that we actually have some real financial information about the company. Under the previous owners, Zaffa, we had no clue what was happening inside, since Zaffa was a privately traded company. The only leaks and information we gained on the financial situation of the UFC during the Zaffa times were when Zaffa was sued. And honestly, Zaffa and UFC has always used this as a hardball tactic. They don't encourage any discussion of fighter pay and their contracts in public. And Endeavor seems to try to continue this path, but they at least have more legal obligations to inform the public about what's going on inside the business. Now let's look at the dirty data that supports the fighters' arguments most when looking at the UFC and Endeavor. We can garner from this Moody's credit report. In 2021, UFC had a revenue of around $1 billion. Now, when questioned about fighter pay, Endeavor and UFC do not give straight answers. If you ask Dana about it, he'll start yelling at your face probably, and on the business side, Endeavor, they just say no comment. But luckily, in one of their earning reports, we have some useful data through which we can calculate the share of revenue from the company that actually goes to the athletes. Endeavor reported in an earnings call that the fighter pay has risen with 26% compounding annual growth rate since 2005. Now, this is some financial terms here. In layman's terms, CAGR basically means the annual growth rate of an investment when you take compounding into account as well. And this is an extremely important number because through this CAGR, we can calculate the average share of revenue that goes to the fighters from the UFC. Endeavor has also told us that total fighter pay has risen 26% CAGR since the year 2005. And we also know how much the total fighter pay was back in 2005. It was $4.3 million. From these numbers, we can calculate how much of the revenue is actually going to the fighters currently. And the numbers are low. With these numbers, we get around 17.5% of the total revenue share going to the fighters. You can compare that with the numbers of NHL, NFL, NBA. Those sports give their athletes around 50% of the revenue they earn. Combine that with the fact that the UFC has disgustingly high profit margins. I mean, of the revenue that they do, they make around 50% in profit. And you still can't pay the fighters anymore. Oh, I do wonder, Dana, I do. And honestly, the more I look into these actual financials and numbers of the UFC, the more disgusted I get with this whole thing. You have Spencer Fisher, Gary Goodrich, and a slew of other fighters who are going to have brain damage in the future. And you still keep raking in those 50% margins to yourself. I mean, that's pretty odd, and you cannot raise the fighter pay under any means. Right, Dana? Let's look a bit more into these contracts. We have a lot of information from ex-UFC fighter Miles Jury on how his contract was set up when he fought in the UFC. These deals are typically pretty long, so the UFC likes to make 6 or even more fight deals with the fighters. Typically, if you're a new fighter, you will get a base pay of $10,000 to show up and $10,000 to win the actual fight. With this, you have a chance to win a $50,000 bonus, which is highly unproportional to the actual base pay these new fighters are getting. After the fighters sign this base contract, they will have to agree to additional bout contract, which will be proposed to them before their fights. This bout contract has information about the basic stuff regarding who is the opponent and where the fight's gonna be held. But it also reinforces your payment for the fight. Here's a chance for fighters to renegotiate their pay fight by fight. But usually the UFC only allows renegotiation if it's a short notice fight. Naturally, the UFC uses these long deals to lock their fighters into contracts, and they have absolutely no choice or chance of even speaking to other organizations. In addition, UFC has the right to match clause in all of their contracts. This basically means that UFC has the power to hold fighters in contract jail for a year after their last fight in order to match all the offers that opposing organizations will give their fighters. This clause basically has the potential to lock a fighter in his prime to his UFC contract for an additional year, taking one of the best years of this fighter's career away from him. Then there's the infamous Champions Clause. This is the clause that held Francis Ngannou locked in his contract for about a year after defending his title against Cyril Gane. This oddball clause gives UFC the right to just extend a fighter's contract after the first time he defends his UFC title in the organization. This extension can be done up to 3 fights or 1 year. Luckily, Francis got out of this deal since his contract had a maximum time of 5 years, but he had to sit around for over a year after the Gane fight, just waiting in contract jail with the UFC, losing time in his prime and plenty of opportunities. The contract also labels the fighters as independent contractors. This basically means that they do not have access to any of the benefits that regular employees would get, and it's way off that UFC treats their fighters like employees still. UFC demands that the fighters use uniforms, they cannot have any own sponsors in their uniforms, and they also really can't get out of their contracts easily. It's made really hard for them. So how on earth do you classify as an entrepreneur, an independent contractor, if you cannot get out of your contract and you have to wear the uniform that your boss says? And it's extremely hard to offer your services elsewhere. But hey guys, we have a really nice boss who really cares about fighter pay, right?